Chuck Schuldiner was born on May 13, 1967, in Long Island, New York, to Mal and Jane Schuldiner. His dad, Mal, was Jewish and the son of Austrian immigrants, while his mom, Jane, who came from the American South, converted to Judaism. The Schuldiners moved to Florida in 1968, where Chuck spent his childhood. Chuck was 9 when his older brother Frank died, and this tragedy deeply affected him, though it would also fuel his creativity later on.
Like, subscribe, thank you.
To deal with his grief, Chuck's parents bought him his first guitar. He started with classical, but by the age of 10, he was all in on the electric guitar. Chuck Schuldiner was a big fan of groups like Judas Priest, Sabbath, Iron Maiden, and was really into the new wave of British metal bands, especially. And this is where he started getting into the heavier groups, Slayer, Metallica, Celtic Frost, and this inspired him to make his own super heavy form of music. Now Chuck, while open to different musical styles, definitely was not a fan of country or rap. He did well in school, but eventually got bored and left. And this was a choice he later wished he had not made. Chuck had said in interviews that he probably would have been a veterinarian or a cook if music had not have worked out. Chuck was mostly self-taught on the guitar, and he really didn't care much for music theory. He really just preferred to focus on whatever it was that would work for his playing. His early vocals in Death featured a deep, raspy growl, which he would later come to find physically taxing, and he just come to dislike doing that style. He'd go on to say that he just hated screaming, but it's interesting because that was integral to their early style. So in 1983, Chuck Schuldiner formed Mantas, which was inspired by the band Nasty Savage, and he would later rename this band to Death. Rick Ross played rhythm guitar, while Cam Lee took care of the drums and the vocals. They put out a few rehearsal tapes, as well as a demo called Death by Metal, which actually turned out to be one of the first ever death metal albums. The guitars were really fast and sharp, the drums barely kept pace, and the vocals were chaotic and malicious, capturing the essence of early thrash metal. By 1985, Death was starting to become a name in the metal underground. And this wasn't thrash metal. It had a faster pace, darker topics, as well as Chuck's unique growl, which would become a defining characteristic of the genre. And even though their early music was really rough around the edges, it paved the way for the full-blown death metal scene. Chuck Schuldiner briefly jammed with the Canadian band Slaughter in Toronto, not the 80s band we had come to know, but he played with them during January of 1986, before heading back to Florida and renaming his band Death. And he changed the name to partially channel the grief from his brother's passing into something good, but also because the music's violent tone was more fitting than any supposed satanic connection to the genre. And even though Chuck's guitar playing was intense, he was also known for being really laid back, a lover of life, animals, and beer. Death in its early days had a revolving door of members, and this would be a trend that would actually define their entire career. Schuldiner's relentless pursuit of perfection, coupled with zero-tolerance drug policy, often caused a lot of friction with the band members. But Death's reputation kept growing, and by 1987, they were already starting to make waves in metal with their debut, Scream Bloody Gore. And this debut, released in 1987, is widely considered the first true death metal album, blending the speed and guttural vocals of thrash, low-tuned guitars, and morbid lyrics into a skull-crushing blend of goodness. Recorded in a few days with drummer Chris Reifert, the album's raw energy and brutal sound really redefined the genre. Zombie Ritual and Evil Dead showed off Chuck's knack for making music that was both technically skilled as well as brutally aggressive. Critics really dug the groundbreaking lyrical themes of horror and gore, where the music actually evoked the shock value of horror films. And though the album wasn't exactly polished, its impact would still resonate through time. So then the band followed up this debut with Leprosy. And that album pushed the death metal sound forward with refined production, more intricate song structures. Chuck's guitar and songwriting abilities were on full display with tracks like Pull the Plug, as well as the title track Leprosy. And this album was recorded at More Sound Recording Studio in Tampa, Florida, which would actually land the studio itself on the map as a hub for death metal groups to come. Scott Burns, the album's producer, became renowned for his knack of capturing the raw energy of death metal, and Leprosy would actually become a crucial album for this group. Already, lyrically, Chuck was getting away from pure gore and starting to hit more towards social commentary. And then in 1990, Death came out with Spiritual Healing, where again they continued to shift and evolve their sound. Lyrically, they started digging into heavier topics: addiction, mental health struggles, religion, to name a few. And this album featured James Murphy on the guitar, Terry Butler on the bass, and Bill Andrews on the drums, where they really took the music to another level. And musically, for this album, Schuldiner was starting to dip into some more rock and fusion influences, especially in his solos. The overall sound was even more polished and refined, but then they would continue to evolve with the album Human, released in '91, where the arrangements became a lot more complex, technical, with more of a progressive style. Songs like Flattening of Emotions, Lack of Comprehension were considered top-notch examples from this album, and he had again changed musicians, bringing in drummer Sean Reinert, Paul Masvidal on the guitar, Steve DiGiorgio on the bass, and these players by this time were respected names on the death metal scene. Human was considered by many death fans to really be their tour de force, and the album would become a relative success as well, selling 200,000 copies worldwide. The next album, Individual Thought Patterns, was released in 1993, and Chuck continued to push that prog and technical sound, incorporating more jazz and classical elements into the already complex compositions. Lyrically, too, Chuck was continuing to branch out, hitting topics like free will and the nature of reality. Some real standout tracks on this one include Overactive Imagination as well as The Philosopher. And it really showcased Chuck's maturity, growing as a songwriter as well as a lyricist. But in '95, the band really hit its peak with the album Symbolic. And this album was really able to show how the band could refine their sound, where they were able to balance making it more accessible to new listeners, but still retaining complexity and emotional depth. Crystal Mountain, as well as Symbolic, which is the title track, are often considered some of his most complex, powerful, and thought-provoking work. And for this album, they had Jim Morris producing it, giving it a really clean and precise sound, which actually highlighted the complex arrangements of the songs. But it was around this time that Chuck also started wanting to explore new musical territory. And so he ended up forming the band Control Denied, delving deeper into the world of death metal. And Chuck was wanting to go for more cleaner vocals, and just as well, he wanted to explore more of a complex style of guitar playing. And this band only released one album, The Fragile Art of Existence, and this one came out in '99. Chuck brought in Tim Amar, who had a really clean and dynamic vocal style. And this album showcased another side of Schuldiner's musical brilliance, with longer songs, diverse rhythms, more of a focus on melody, all while retaining his signature technical skill by this time. Breaking the Broken, as well as the title track, The Fragile Art of Existence, stood out thanks to their complex arrangements as well as thought-provoking lyrics. Sadly, this would also be Chuck's final album. In 1999, Chuck was starting to experience extreme neck pain, and so he started going to chiropractors, thinking that maybe he just needed some neck adjustments. But that wasn't working, and the chiropractors advised him that maybe he might want to go for an MRI. It was at that point Chuck was officially diagnosed with a brain tumor called pontine glioma, which affected his brainstem. And this was right as Control Denied was starting to become big in the music scene. And Schuldiner, despite this devastating diagnosis, kept writing music, refusing to let the illness control him. But the problem was, even though he was a celebrated metal musician by this time, he still wasn't making a whole hell of a lot of money. He didn't have health insurance, and as a result, he struggled to pay for the care that he really desperately needed. So he would often put off important procedures, some of which may have possibly even saved his life. Nevertheless, the metal community stepped up, throwing benefit concerts and fundraisers in order to help him with medical bills. And Chuck was going through all sorts of treatment, including chemo and radiation, but his health continued to deteriorate. And eventually his immune system was so weakened by all of the treatment that he ended up developing pneumonia. And on December 13th, 2001, Chuck Schuldiner passed away at 34 years old. His death signaled the end of an era, but Chuck's influence on metal music is undeniable. He redefined metal by blending brutal intensity with intellectual depth in his songwriting. And also, Chuck's willingness to experiment and evolve influenced a ton of bands and musicians, both death metal pioneers as well as progressive metal innovators. Bands like Opeth and Gojira also cite Schuldiner's work as influences. Death's Human album made it onto Decibel magazine's Hall of Fame in 2011, acknowledging its impact on the metal scene. The Symbolic landed on many best of lists, praised for both its technical musicianship as well as emotional impact of the songs themselves. Now, the thing is, after the Spiritual Healing album, Chuck Schuldiner stopped working with full-time band members. He was starting to prefer working with studio and live venue musicians, and a lot of this had to do with bad relationships with previous band members. And as a result, Chuck actually got a lot of flack, where people called him a perfectionist in the metal community. But a lot of it came down to the fact that he just wasn't big into the drug thing, and he really disagreed with band members on that aspect. Chuck always saw himself as being on the path of improvement, and he expected the same from people who were working with him. Something really weird I just found out: the most expensive guitar on Amazon is a signature guitar, and you won't believe whose signature guitar it is. I left the link below in the description. And to my subscribers, I really want to thank you so much for all the inspiration and feedback. I truly do appreciate it. And if you haven't had a chance to subscribe to this channel, make sure you smack that subscribe button. While you're at it, hit the like button, join the family, and want to thank you so much for watching.